there's a place for personality in learning and development. There's particularly a place for personality in e-learning, and if you do it in the right way, you can create warm, engaging experiences which stand in contrast to this very regular diet of boilerplate, compliancy, click nexty content. And I think if you can find that space and find that voice, there's very powerful results to be had.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are and wherever you're watching from. I'm Matt Pierce, host of the Visual Lounge, where we talk about using images and video in the workplace and sometimes so much more. Today, we are going to be talking about the modern workplace, the traditional workplace, and maybe some of the things that aren't working so well with it in terms of learning. So workplace learning, as you probably all have experienced, might have some problems. There's also a lot of good out there. And today, our guest, Jonathan Hill, is going to be chatting with us more about that. So with that said, let's introduce Jonathan. Jonathan Hill is an award-winning learning manager and e-learning developer based in the UK, currently working in the gaming and gambling industry. He is an articulate superhero and also a big fan of Camtasia. Woohoo! Thank you, Jonathan. And likes to experiment with training formats to challenge traditional ideas of workplace learning, which is why I want to welcome Jonathan Hill to the Visual Lounge. Jonathan, welcome.
Hi, Matt. Good to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Yo, it is so great to have you here. We have, I think we've crossed paths in like on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and all across the social media stuff. But it's just brilliant to be able to have you here and be able to chat with you. So real quick, anything I didn't say in the introduction that people should know about you before we dive into our questions?
No, that was very fair. After being arrested, that was a very fair summary. That was...
Well, if people don't know you, I do want to recommend they go out and find your profile and connect with you, because I know you always have great things to say and you're always sharing with the community and putting out great information, particularly our friends who are using Articulate Storyline, which is you're brilliant at as well. So there's my little plug for you. But let's jump into our three questions that we always ask everybody. So our first question is, you mentioned you're a fan of Camtasia, so I feel like this is fair game. How did you get involved with starting to use video?
Yeah, so as an e-learning designer, I moved into Articulate in particular from PowerPoint. So I had a kind of slide mentality. And I think a lot of people who perhaps start as SMEs and then move into authoring tools in that way tend to take that slide mentality with them. And slides tend to be snapshots. They tend to be frozen moments in time, don't they, of data, headlines, often too much information. We've all sat through those presentations. That's why my Twitter handle is dev by PowerPoint, because it's a bit of a pun, because so often actually now I still go back to PowerPoint when I'm speccing things out. But obviously one of the limitations is it tends to be quite a static format. And if you take that mindset into e-learning design, your e-learning designs can feel a bit slidey, a bit kind of static and slidey. So there were occasions when I first started getting into e-learning where the obvious low-hanging fruit for video was screen grabs, screen captures, showing systems and processes in what was a financial services industry, in the insurance industry, and how to navigate claims systems and the like, and screen capture. So I first started to get involved in video via that, because what would often happen is my subject matter experts would do a screen capture of a process, and the mouse would be all over the screen. There'd be lots of like heavy pauses and then lots of really fast activity, and I got into editing those videos to kind of take those errors out, but also work with the screen geography, as I like to call it, the system geography. There's areas of a screen, particularly in financial products, which you don't need to focus on for the bit that you're training on. So I was getting into pans and zooms and cropping, and that's what got me into it. I wanted to just focus on what was move away from a slide mentality, but also then use editing tools to focus in on what was important on that shot. And I also got to do a few little promotional videos for the company I was working at the time. We were given a budget to go and buy a camera, and went out and filmed some interviews with key members of staff. So I also started to get involved in video that way as well. And I think without having done that, and without having cut my teeth in that way, I perhaps still would have had that. Here's a slide of information. Here's a slide of information. and it just kind of breaks you out of that a bit. And the way that video can kind of, particularly if you use it at the start of a course, can really kind of set the tone, set the scene, and really grab attention. That's what I've developed into recently, using it as lots of cold opens. Look at this terrible situation and how can we fix it, and kind of set the challenge for the learner.
I love that, and I love that you made that transition, because I think I do see a lot of people going from that slide mentality to, I need something more robust. I need something that's going to be not so just static, and video is a great way. And I love that even today I saw some examples of video that on LinkedIn, someone posted this example of all these kind of short snippets, kind of like TikTok style videos that were put together for Excel. It was awesome. But the thing is, I couldn't read the formulas. Like on my screen, I'm like, it's a great example of video, but I can't see that little formula that you're typing out. And so, there's lots of ways that you can enhance with those pans and zooms and focus that attention. So that's great. Okay, next question. And we're going to talk more about workplace learning here in later on, but I want to ask you this question. What does success for workplace learning look like for you?
That is the $64,000 question, isn't it? If you ask,
that's why we get paid the big bucks here.
if you ask the accountants, it's return on investment, and if you ask L&D, it's often still focused on reaction to learning. I don't think as an industry we go far enough into Kirkpatrick as we need to, and we're somewhat happy, somewhat content with with happy sheets that come out of a course, at the end of a course, at the end of the training session. If everyone was happy with the training, then that's the result. So I think there's a real need to demonstrate that what you've produced, the intervention you put in place, has had the outcome that was desired. So if somewhere in the business a dashboard is flashing, a warning light on a dashboard is flashing that something is going wrong, there needs to be a really good root cause analysis as to what's going wrong before you even chuck training at it. And then if the solution is training, either in full or in part, having implemented that, has that light stopped flashing on the dashboard? And that to me really is the kind of very kind of Fisher Price summary of where we need to be. Someone comes to you with a problem, establish it's a problem that can be solved by L&D, and then once you've deployed your solution, has that warning light stop flashing? And those are the metrics that the business are going to look at, and in particular those are metrics that any senior leadership team are going to look at. And if that dashboard light's still flashing at the next senior leadership team meeting, they're going to be looking at L&D and asking why. So I've become much more mindful of that as I've advanced in my career and become a learning manager. I still like to get into the nuts and bolts of design and all that good stuff that creates the really inclusive, warm, detailed experience for users, and they come away from that experience feeling like they've gained something and had a good experience. But I also need to talk hard numbers sometimes, and that's where we get into the impact of that.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of, as you said, $64,000 question, right? It's the one thing that I think a lot of groups struggle with, how to connect what's happening with the learning to those actual outcomes. And, I feel very fortunate, come from a education background where we talked about systems, right? And training was not always in the system the answer. So you're looking for like, what is the solution that's going to work here? Maybe it's the way, we often use the example of assembly lines, right? Maybe the assembly line of whatever, the taco, the machinery was in the wrong order, or there's efficiencies that could be gained there. And that's really the problem. So I love that you're thinking that way. And we'll talk more about workplace learning here in a few minutes. But before we do that, what's one tip you could give the audience to help them improve using, let's focus on video. So what's one tip they could use you could give them to help improve using video in their workplace? We'll say learning, even workplace learning.
I think the single biggest thing you can do is, regardless of lighting, setting, effects, it's just the sound. You've got to get the sound right, because particularly if you're expecting people to sit and watch and listen, the sound is really important. And then obviously paired with that, for those for whom sound isn't an option, either environmental or personal reasons, closed captioning, and making sure you get at least both, because frankly everything else is kind of a nice to have. The visuals need to be clear, of course, but if you can't understand what somebody's saying or follow what somebody's describing, then there's little point to doing it. And and sound is, I mean, such a hard thing to get right. But when you do, it really pays dividends.
Yeah, well, I love that tip, and I have to admit, we know on the show there have been times when I've chosen the wrong microphone, or somebody showed up as a guest and they didn't have, like, we had some people outside, and there was birds in the background. Like, we know that happens, but your point is so important, right? So, and do every time you can, do the best you can. We love good audio. Good audio to me is such an important piece of any good video. So great tip. So, Jonathan, we're going to take a quick break and we'll come back in just a second. Hey everybody, just want to interrupt for half a second here to tell you about TechSmith Academy. TechSmith Academy is a learning platform where you can go and learn all about using video and images. We have a ton of free resources. All you do is go log in, create an account, or use your TechSmith account. Go and access any of the courses we have available. For instance, we have Nick Nimmin has 4 different courses out there that will help you learn about making video and how to make better videos and what to make videos about. We've got videos about how other people are making their videos, like with Oz Du Soleil, or we've got things about writing helpful help with Michelle Wiederman. We've got other great creators, including myself, out there talking about making videos, whether it's your first video or your 100th video or beyond. We've got something that's there for you to help you make better screencasts, to get set up, learning how to get good audio, and a whole bunch more. So go to academy.techsmith.com, log in, and check out any of the resources. Again, all for free. We'll see you over there. All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here with Jonathan Hill. We're talking about workplace learning. Jonathan, let's dive into this topic deep. First question: we talked about kind of the results, what defines good outcomes, right? The measurement earlier on in the episode. But when you're thinking about workplace learning, let's go step back, kind of really high level. What are you talking about workplace learning? Is it all learning in the workplace? Is it, are the limitations here? Is it like where do you focus on when you talk about workplace learning?
That is another $64,000 question, isn't it? We're totting up quite a bill here. I think it depends on the culture of the business versus the resources that they have and the constraints that the users, the learners operate in. What I think most organisations do well is putting regular mandated compliancy content in front of people on a pretty regular basis for obvious reasons. And I think most large organisations are pretty good at that. Where I see learning and L&D taking that further is almost embedding a learning culture that encourages people to visit those resources outside of those times in ways that meet them in the flow of work and in ways that don't take them away from their work in such large numbers for such large quantities of time that it affects the actual business you're trying to support. So there's definitely a balance to be had there between resources and courses, and sometimes a desk aid is enough. You don't need to go, fully featured e-learning or video. Sometimes a desk aid will be enough, but that's part of a wider learning culture that allows people the option to visit and obtain access to information in a variety of formats that meet them in the flow of work. And that's the bit that I think most organizations can always do better at, and taking their learning platform and the learning content away from it being a kind of mandated experience to something that people actually enjoy doing and will seek out in their quiet moments. So my career today has been largely around regulated industries like insurance, financial services, and most recently gaming and gambling. But what they have in common is that they're often the coalface of those businesses are often call centres with agents who are taking calls, taking chats with customers. They've got wrap times, they've got targets to meet, and slotting in learning into that routine. I've seen a gradual push toward more micro learning formats to support that. And also interfaces with platforms that they use regularly. So I've seen some quite inventive uses of Teams and Slack and other communication channels that most modern businesses use, and learning integrations that kind of speak to those systems as well are very exciting as well, because you're not only meeting them in the flow of their job, you're meeting them actually in the screen that they work in on a day-to-day basis, and competing for your audience's attention against everything else that they've got going on, whilst allowing them to still service their customers. That's the golden formula for me, and just pushing beyond you must sit down and do your work, as they say on South Park. It's that's not a culture I like to impose or follow.
Yeah. So, I was going to ask you as my next question, what are workplaces getting right? And I think what I heard from you, since you already answered, I think you answered some of the question, was this idea of some companies, organizations are moving to this workplace culture. This idea that learning is obviously there's times for compliance training. We know as much as we all cringe a little bit. Oh, in fact, I've got some in my inbox I've got to go do. I'm going to do it later today. Despite the fact that we have to have those, it sounds like that workplace culture is about ingraining kind of learning at points of need. So let me ask you this instead of what are they getting right? How, if I'm in an organization and maybe I'm in a learning role, or maybe I'm in my organization thinking, hey, I want to help them get better. How do I start to make sure that this happens? How do you infuse kind of a workplace learning culture? Because culture is a big thing. It's hard to move. I think oftentimes culture, I feel like, springs up around kind of what's there. So what advice would you give us if we're like, okay, I have some of these challenges. I want to move in that direction. I want to make a difference in my workplace learning. A $64,000 question. Our bill after this thing is going to be so. I don't have the kind of resources to pay it for this. Not what the funds we get on this podcast. So. But what are your thoughts, Jonathan?
I think this goes beyond sort of asynchronous and e-learning as well. I think there needs to be a very clear journey for anyone entering that business as to what support they will receive in terms of learning and training and resources throughout their career. And that's got to be aligned to the trajectory of their career. So you come in as an entry-level employee, and as you become more highly qualified, highly skilled, more highly tenured, what support do you get? And in turn, what support do you offer others who are not quite as far along that journey as you? Because what I see as a big part of this is you'll have formal trainers and formal e-learning designers, but also creating almost an ecosystem in which you recognize you have mentors, team leaders, SMEs in the business. I'm a big fan of putting people in those positions through a kind of basic training without making it sound like Full Metal Jacket. Like a basic training in mentoring skills and being able to have learning conversations with their staff, and that's a combination of being able to coach and mentor their colleagues, but also being up to date as to what resources are available, and almost act as an ambassador for and promoter of the system, and have a kind of try and produce a virtuous circle. In fact, so people go through this process, they become advocates for the process and help others through the same process. And then with that, you need some policies that support that. So where you do have busy workplaces where time is precious, I think you need to ring fence some people's time for those learning events that can't be in the flow of work. You do need a bit of dedicated time, sometimes even a dedicated area. So you think of a call center floor. There might even be a side room where you just set up a slightly different environment for learning to occur, be it e-learning or in-person training. It's surprising how many organisations try and carry out formal training on the floor or in huddles while everything else is going on, and that has its place and it does work and it's part of the bigger learning culture. But I think having dedicated time and space as well for focused learning activity, as well as that peer-to-peer mentor support, is really, really crucial as well. And a lot of LMS providers have latched onto this as well. And many of the main LMS providers now provide space in the system to do that, and also allow appointed people in the business to capture their own screens, make their own videos, pop it onto the system and share their knowledge and expertise, and have it kind of being a kind of self-sustaining system as well. And personally, I'd like to reach that point with my own organisation. Hand on heart, we're not at that point at the moment, but that's where I see, it becoming not just a question of return on investment, because it becomes just part of the machinery of the business, and where problems do emerge, they almost self-correct, and that would be the ultimate L&D environment and culture for me.
Yeah, not by no means easy to do, right? It's something, but I think it's these conversations that are helpful, because I know in the few places that I've worked, it's tough. It would be tough to make that change to that kind of the whole scale, because what I love the approach though is that you're talking about, like, you have multiple pieces. It's not just about the compliance. It's not just about face-to-face training. It's about using all the resources and assets and making sure they fit at the time and place that makes the most sense for when learning. Probably going to be, I would say people are going to be receptive to it or open to it, or even pulling them away from the busy spot so that they can focus on it, right? Like it feels different, right? I step into my office, before we started the show, many people, maybe they know this, maybe they don't, but I have the stinger that I used for the live show for 2.5 years. And I still play that even though it's not in the show anymore. And the reason I play is because it sets the mind, right? Like I know, okay, I have to be on the podcast. And I imagine pulling people into a room that's set up a little bit differently. It's quieter. That allows them to change kind of like, oh, I have a different type of focus and attention than, I'm not trying to answer calls or whatever it is you're doing. So
Totally, yeah.
So you talked a little bit about this, and I want to come back to it because I think it's, as a show, the Visual Lounge, this is what we talk about. You talked about using micro-learning. You talked about getting people to use kind of maybe make their own videos as a mentor to help people. So from a media perspective, what's the role of multimedia, whether that's images, video, we'll throw in interactive kind of e-learning stuff. What role does that play in this content? It sounds like it's got a role. There's lots probably things you can do with it, but how would you help an organization to maybe narrow down on what to use when?
Yeah, so I think clearly things like video and short videos and carefully curated suites of videos are really, really good to give people quick 2 or 3 minute summaries of a topic, guides on how to do something. It might be part of a process they don't do often, but it's perhaps as important that they know where to go for the refresher than perhaps know the process. And that's part of the magic here as well, I think, is that when you are curating multimedia content, that it gets the message across in a succinct way, and people know where to find it and can access it readily and easily in order to get the answer they need, often to help a customer, often just to refresh themselves as they're doing a task that's infrequent but important, and perhaps mapping out per job role, what's the bread and butter activity for that job role, what's a nice to know, what's a need to know, what's something I don't call upon often, and then cutting your cloth accordingly and creating resources that best fit that topic and best fit the format and best fit the time and space in which that needs to be consumed. It is a bit of an old chestnut, though, that every time I need to fix something in the house, I go straight on YouTube and watch a video on how to fix it. It's a washing machine seal, or I need to change a tap. So the power of seeing someone do something, watching someone else do it, and having that broken down into steps that you can easily replicate. We do it all the time in our personal lives. We're not quite so good at doing it in our workplace, because we tend to oscillate between, here's a PDF with lots of information in case you need it, and here's a 2-hour training course that you need to sit all the way through, and the navigation's locked. And it's that oscillation, I think, that kind of puts people off, and we need to meet them somewhere in the middle. And multimedia is definitely one of the purest and more immediate ways of doing that when you do it well.
So one of the things I wonder about, I think a lot of people in the L&D industry who've worked in there a long time, or even generally, I think if you've ever worked with a subject matter expert, or SME is however you like to call them, often and I am guilty of this, right? Even in the show, I'm an expert. I know a lot. I have a tendency to say like too much. And as soon as we empower some of our peers that are not learning and development experts, and I think we're just as guilty of this when it comes to our stuff, but when we empower them to say like, hey, let's start making this stuff so it's immediate on demand. We can fix the tap or the washer seal or whatever it is that they need to do in their equivalent in their workplace. How do you help make sure that your kind of non-expert learning and development people, subject matter experts, are making stuff that is going to fit well and work in those environments? What advice do you give to folks that you work with?
I've in the past used what I call the Twitter challenge. And I know Twitter isn't in good favour at the moment, but what I've tended to do in the past is I've said to subject matter experts, thanks for your 14 pages of content. Um, could we get this into 14 tweets? What are the, what are the big takeaways from each of these pages? And can you say that in 240 characters or less and treat it almost like a Twitter challenge? So if you were tweeting this information to your followers rather than sharing it with your colleagues, how would you go about doing it in a way that met that format? Now, that's not to say that the final product would be restricted in the same way, but it just gets them to focus on, crikey, yeah, if I was trying to broadcast this via a platform like Twitter that had such restrictions, and I didn't have the luxury of loads of video, a team of e-learning designers, 4 hours of my colleagues' time, how would I get this over to them? And that's something I've used probably for 5 or 10 years now in terms of sitting down with SMEs. Um, and you can kind of say to them in that way without saying to them, this is a bit long-winded or you need to get to the point. We'll say, I often sometimes use as cover as well, and I hope no one's watching this. So I've had this conversation with my layout won't accommodate a question of that length, for instance, or my layout. If I put all this content in, I'm going to have to change the font size and start messing around with my layout. So could you do me a favour, do me a solid, and just cut this back a bit to what it really needs to say, so we can meet the layout. And often that's about making sure the layout also supports the visuals as well. So the importance of the visuals and the text supporting each other. Um, and you can also then go into some of the psychology of question design as well. And one of the things that SMEs are usually guilty of is the longest answer is usually the correct one,
Mm-hmm.
and excessive use of jargon, which gives away the correct answer. So another challenge I set to them is about plausible distractors. So when we get into assessments as well, where sometimes those conversations can go off the rails a little bit, is talk to them about, if you were trying to trick a colleague into making the wrong decision, if you're being really mean, what would be the plausible answers here, rather than just throwing a few sentences together, which by comparison are obviously the wrong answer. And those are the two common pitfalls I found in those relationships. It's too much content, or it's too technical, it's too jargony, and meeting them in the middle by setting them little challenges on how to refine that content, almost gamifying the conversation, if you will, has paid dividends. And I've enjoyed some really positive relationships with SMEs over the years by working with them in that way.
Well, I love that idea of whether Twitter is in favor or not. That short, like, okay, if I had to send this via a short text message, or short Twitter, a short tweet, or whatever it is, I love that idea that like that's the focus, because then you can still put the most important thing, but you only get so many times to do that, because after 14 tweets, I'm probably done. It's a really long thread, right? But I think they understand that, and so I love that idea, and I'm assuming it applies to video as well, right? Like, well, we used to make tutorial videos back long time ago now, over 10 years ago, and you had real file restrictions. You could only upload certain sizes to YouTube. YouTube had a 15-minute limit. We had a product, Jing, that could only record 5 minutes, right? Like, you had real limitations, and those were often some of our best videos, because they constraints of like, well, if this is bigger, I think it was 4 megabytes. If we had videos, we couldn't put them on our website. Can you imagine a 4 megabyte video now? That's insane. This video alone will be like 400 megabytes.
Yeah, so. and you can see how the technology influences your solutions in exactly that way. And sometimes playing to the restrictions that you are imposed or impose on yourself can really bring out the best in the content as well, because it really forces you to focus on what's absolutely pertinent to the topic.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up today, Jonathan, I want to talk to you about humor. I know you've done some stuff with humor. You look engagebraintrain.com. I think you had some stuff on there that's some humor stuff. First of all, what's the appropriate role of humor in learning? Is there a role, or should we just be really serious all the time?
I think there's definitely a balance to be struck, but I think if you ask most people who their favourite teacher was at school, largely that will be the teacher who was clearly competent at their job, clearly knowledgeable in their topic, but also presented it with humour and with humanity. There's a famous psychology experiment, and the name always escapes me, but they get 3 panelists on a radio show, and the one guy is answering all the questions expertly, but he's got no personality, and he's almost robotic. The next guy's probably nearly doing as well as him, but he spills his drink on himself in the course of it. And then the third guy is absolutely incompetent. And when they test the reactions to the personalities on those three characters, the second guy, who's competent but fallible and has a bit of humour, always comes out as the most likable, and people engage with that. So I think there's a place to be that guy in e-learning in particular. A lot of e-learning is pretty boilerplate. It's pretty by the numbers. Once you've done it for a while, you can even sometimes tell which authoring tool has been used with your eyes closed. Um, and that's not a bad thing. But imagine you're, you know, at the coalface in a business. You see this content trotted out in front of you every year at the same time. Um, I'd like to be a little bit inventive about what that looks like and how that performs, and occasionally that will involve humour. So if the topic lends itself to humour, I'm all for using it. But I've been fortunate to work in environments where that's been the case. Um, there are definitely topics, and I don't think I'll have to name them, that you couldn't use humour for, because it would be disrespectful, it would be, rude or libelous. But there are lots of occasions where you can use humour to engage your learners. There's studies to show it makes things more memorable, makes content more memorable, and my advice would be to make it context specific. So try and relate it to the context of the topic as much as possible. But there are occasions where you can perhaps go a little bit Monty Python, have an interaction that doesn't perform quite as expected. So for inspiration, I'd say look at the way, look what happens when you're disconnected to the internet on a Google browser on your phone. And
Yep.
you can play the little dinosaur game. Now nobody expected that to be there, but it's fun. It's a little bit of a distraction until the internet's back on and you can Google away again. So there's times like that in courses, I think, where rather than having a click next, your interaction might just be a little bit more whimsical. And there's a place for fun in functional. As long as the fun doesn't take you away from being functional and it's still easy to navigate, there's ways that you can do that. And I've had a lot of fun with cartoon characters, robotic characters, characters who you can put through things that if you put a human through them would be a very different matter. But you think of Wile E. Coyote, of course, and cartoon humour. So there's lots you can do. Even if it's just a dad joke, even if it's just a pun, even if it's just the title of your course has got a pun in it, anything that just makes it kind of stick in the mind. Humour does have a place, but of course you need to get that signed off, and it needs to be appropriate.
Well, that is actually a perfect segue to my next question, and I'll just jump to it rather than all the comments I was going to say about having the internet come back on right during a high score run of the dinosaur game. But this does seem like a thing you got to get signed off on. And so obviously, if let's say we're having a conversation, you're trying to convince me to use some fun in the functional here, and I'm maybe the CLO or VP of something, and I'm like, humor gets us into trouble, or I don't know. That's how do you, what from a kind of corporate leadership standpoint, how do you go about getting that buy-in? Because it does seem like humor is subjective. Humor can be tough. If you get it wrong, it can go really wrong, even if you're not intending. And obviously, there's subjects that are not the place to try to cut your stand-up chops on. But so Jonathan, what do you say to those leaders who are a little hesitant to allow some fun in your learning courses?
I mean, I'd reference someone like Rance Green and his work on storytelling, and Christy Tucker and branching scenarios, and how there's space in storytelling and branching scenarios in particular to illustrate the unhappy path, when things go wrong, and sometimes the unhappy path can be quite humorous. Sometimes you can make the if you place the learner in a third person perspective rather than a first person perspective, they can kind of laugh at the person making the mistakes. The learner becomes a kind of god in the machine, as it were. They choose the events that befall the character, and when things go slightly wrong, a pratfall, a drink spilt on them. I mean, these are just kind of frivolous examples, but as long as you link it to storytelling, and as long as it's within the context of the topic, I would find it difficult to become accidentally offend or invoke a kind of legal proceedings if you stay in your lane, stay related to the topic. So as long as you link it to the storytelling, and you can sort of convey to your senior leadership team that the power of storytelling in terms of learning. um, some stories have funny endings. The unhappy path in a branching scenario could have a funny ending, and that repetition and reward. Perhaps you get to the funny ending, you failed, something funny's happened. It kind of just leaves you. You've got feedback to say that you failed, but it's come in a kind of almost like a compliment sandwich. You've had a bit of it's wrapped in a joke, so you're more predisposed perhaps to kind of repeat it and have a kind of warmer experience as a result. So that would be my pitch. But you're right, it's not entirely appropriate, and it's always going to be subject to sign off.
Yeah. Well, I love that, right? That it's going to bring, you're going to bring in these stories. Life is not always serious. Funny things happen to us. We have funny stories. So I also say though, here's, because you are the little bit I've gotten to know you, you are funny. You have great timing and you've got some comedy skills, I suppose. Humor's hard though. It's hard to be funny. If you've ever been around like a 6-year-old telling a joke and you're just like, that's not funny at all, right? Like, so I wonder, for those of us who maybe feel humor challenged, it doesn't, I mean, we're saying humor broadly, right? Humor, it doesn't have to be funny necessarily. It could be fun, but what would you say to those people who are like, gosh, I'm just not good at that. I'm not good at the fun part of it. Play inspiration. You mentioned storytelling. Any place else I could go, or anything else I could look at to help me to do that better and maybe make a more convincing case.
Yeah. So I think that the way I start off a lot, and you'll see this with my e-learning heroes challenges, is what's great about the e-learning heroes challenges is you're completely unburdened by a senior leadership team, a brief, a client. It's a complete blank canvas. Um, but sometimes my way into those challenges is a pun, a play on words from either the title of the challenge, the topic of the challenge, and that gives you a kind of often unboxes, reveals a story. And word association exercises, I think, are really easy way to get into that kind of dad joke punnery, which can then kind of unlock a theme, a story, characters. And don't be afraid to play around with that. You can be quite on the nose sometimes when it comes to using puns, and the worst reaction you're going to get is a groan. Other people are going to get a chuckle out of it. But again, you're kind of the play on words often works because double meanings then kind of become sticky, as Julie Dirksen would say. In
Yep.
learning terms, it's sticky. You're being asked to integrate two meanings at the same time, which is ultimately what we're doing with a lot of training content. We're asking people to integrate new information with what they already know, particularly as adult learners. So punnery and wordplay is a really great place to start. Um, so there are lots of this is very UK specific, but I think you can probably find it outside of the UK. There are lots of great Radio 4 comedy programs in the UK, and often they are panel game shows. One is called "I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue," which is heavily around wordplay, and because it's a podcast, it's a radio show. There's no visual. The pictures that people paint with words. Listening to comics do that on a regular basis, and being prepared to get a few groans from the audience. There's always going to be a couple of groans here and there, but when they strike gold, it's really, really good. And there's a round in that show in particular called the Uxbridge English Dictionary, where they give alternative meanings for existing words, which is really, really funny. And there may be a US equivalent. I'm not aware of this, but that kind of comedy, where you're perhaps listening to the way people use words, has been for me the way into it. And then, of course, visual comedy is really big as well. I mean, I grew up on a staple diet of Monty Python, and one of the things I really loved in that was the animations that Terry Gilliam used to put in between the
Mm-hmm.
sketches as well. So sometimes, silly imagery can work as well, and silly things happening to silly people ultimately. So you've got a character in an e-learning course who's made a series of really poor decisions. He's not going to be compliant. What's the most comical outcome that can happen to him or her to illustrate that this person should have behaved better? And like I said, that journey for me often begins with a little bit of wordplay.
Well, I love that. And so before we move into our speed round, I have to ask, you mentioned dad jokes a few times. So do you have a favorite dad joke?
Oh, you put me on the spot now. I love them all. I mean, I love just being able to do a dad joke and do it kind of unprompted. So my son brought a book home from school. It was Greek myths and legends, and I claimed it was all about Greek people's feet because it was leg ends, not legends. and and it was worth it just for the groan, from my son. It's stuff like that. And I think if you can be quick about it in the moment, that works even better. If you have to go away and think about it and then come back an hour later and say, "Oh, you remember that book you were reading?" It doesn't quite work. So getting practice with just making those word associations is really key to it, I think.
Well, I'm going to have to store that in my dad joke database or my database.
Very good.
All right. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. We're going to dive into our quick speed round questions, and then we'll wrap things up for today. So let's go on to speed round. All right, Jonathan, here what we're going to do, we've got a 12-sided die. We're going to roll, and we're going to ask one of 12 questions. So let's switch to our dice cam. Maybe not. Let's try this one. There we go. And hopefully these don't roll all over the floor like they did last time. Ooh, a 12. I think this is the first time we've had a chance to ask this question. So question 12. What's your one go-to tool that helps you get your job done on a regular basis? So it could be software, it could be hardware, it could be the tool that you're always going back to and recommend.
It's PowerPoint. I'm sorry, it's PowerPoint. I mean, I don't know what it is. It kind of draws me back every time. If I want to sketch something out quickly, it's PowerPoint. Just being able to export vector images from PowerPoint, that's just like it's worth the price of admission. Just to mock something up quickly, but often the quality is there for final products.
I have to say, PowerPoint gets dogged on a lot, and mostly because we use it poorly in industry, but I love it. I use it all the time as well. And, in fact, I just had to do a conversion from PowerPoint to Google Slides to get, long story short, to get some videos to play on this new online platform. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so painful because PowerPoint, it's there's so much you can do with it. So great answer. All right, let's go back to our dice cam here. And question 2. It rolled off, so I'm just going to slide it over so you can see, is question number 5. So, Jonathan, you truly are an expert at creating interactive learning modules and creating learning experiences and get to talk about, that in your bio and your work. But what's something else that you're an expert in that we might not know?
Ooh, what am I expecting that you might not know about? I build a lot of Lego. I'm a really big fan of Lego, some of which you can see behind me.
Yeah.
We've got lots of the more advanced sets, and I just really enjoy making things out of Lego. But I am a little bit Will Ferrell about them not being dismantled once they've been built. I'm like the dad in a Lego movie. Once they're built, they're built. So yeah, but I've made a couple of my own creations, and there's some software you can use where you can design it online in 3D, and then you order the parts. And my wife and I have had words about that. I need to stop doing that. It's quite a drain on the bank account.
Legos are not cheap. We are working on a Viking longship with my son right now. This is his first
Lovely.
Lego set. He's 11, and I think my wife and I are enjoying it way more than he is, which is part of the fun, I guess. But he'll get there. So, okay, well, let's do one more question. So here's what the dice is. Let's see what it's going to say. Oh, it is just off screen a little bit. So let me just slide it over here and up. And it is question number 10. Okay. So Jonathan, you're working in industry. It's awesome. Things are going great. What's coming up next for you? Anything that we should know about? We're not asking you if you're changing careers or anything like that, but just generally, what's next?
What's next? I really enjoyed speaking at DevLearn this year. I spoke at the Articulate conference, the co-located event, slightly before the main conference. So I think this year, well, next year rather, I might try and get a speaker spot at the main conference. So that's the kind of long term thing I think for the next 12 months. Um, but every day's a school day. I'm always tinkering around with all the softwares that I use. Getting more and more and more into JavaScript. I can't quite see the matrix yet, but I'm getting there. Um, and just pushing things as far as I can in terms of how we present the content, how the software performs, getting the most from that. But also now through the lens of sharing those experiences and that expertise with my team. I have a team of 7 designers based in Manila, who I was fortunate enough to be able to visit this year as well and spent a fortnight with. And I got to the point now where I've always been very open about sharing what I've learned, but I'm now kind of doing that in a more structured way with my team, as I've become more about managing the team rather than doing the do myself on a day-to-day basis. But I still like to keep my hand in.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jonathan, it has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Before we wrap up with our final take, if someone wants to connect with you, they want to learn more from you, where should they go to find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, as John Hill on LinkedIn, John Hill 123. In fact, really imaginative dad email address there almost. And I've got my own website, which is Engage Brain Train, and I am on Twitter as Dev by PowerPoint as well. And you can find me on those 3 platforms in the main.
All right. Sounds good. So as we like to wrap up our shows, we always give our guests a chance to give their final take, a short, quick answer to kind of summarize everything we've talked about. So Jonathan Hill, what is your final take?
My final take is that there's a place for personality in learning and development. There's particularly a place for personality in e-learning. And if you do it in the right way, you can create warm, engaging experiences which stand in contrast to this very regular diet of boilerplate, compliancy, click nexty content. And I think if you can find that space and find that voice, there's very powerful results to be had.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan Hill. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and go out and connect with him. Go
Thank
find
you.
him. Send him some Legos, maybe. I don't know. He can't afford them anymore, but he could use them. So I want to thank you again, Jonathan Hill, for joining me. And we want to thank everybody for joining us, as always, for every week. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. We always like it if you like and subscribe or leave comments so we know what you're finding helpful and useful. And of course, we'd like to wrap up the show the way we always do. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, we hope you find a little time to level up. Thanks, everybody.